Welcome to the Ourdadsstamps YouTube channel. My name's Pete West, and like a lot of people my age, I started collecting stamps as a child, encouraged by my father, who was an avid collector. 20 years ago I inherited his collection, and at the same time I also inherited my wife's dad's collection. Since then I've been buying and selling stamps through my online stores at Delcamp and eBay under the name Ourdadsstamps. And this has allowed me to grow the collection into what you see behind me. With these videos, I want to share some stories and information that I've learnt about stamps and stamp collecting. I hope you enjoy them, and if you do, don't forget to click on the like button and subscribe to get regular updates on new content. Hello again, and welcome to Ourdadsstamps video podcast. And I'm pleased to welcome Sheila to another edition. So welcome, Sheila.
Thank you for inviting me.
Sheila's here to ask all the questions that you want to know the answers to.
Yeah, I put myself in the shoes of a beginner stamp collector and maybe those who haven't got as much experience as you have.
Today we're going to look at perforations and how to use the various perforation gauges. We owe the invention of perforation gauges to a guy called Jacques Legrand, who was a French philatelist in the late 19th century, who really studied perforations and realised that that could make a huge difference when trying to identify the different stamps. And the perforations are the holes in the margins of stamps, which helps you separate them. And they're measured in the number of holes per 2 centimetres. Stanley Gibbons, in their catalogue, when it lists the perforations, will list something like P14, which means it's got perforation of 14 holes per 2 centimetres. Usually it's in halves or whole numbers, but sometimes they're different along the side than they are along the top. So if you see one that says perf 14 times 12.5, what that means is the top and bottom of the stamp are perf 14 and the sides of the stamp are perf 12.5.
So if we can just go back a bit, my understanding is stamps were originally printed on a sheet of paper, and somebody at the post office would have got a pair of scissors and literally cut the stamps out. Probably not that perfectly. So my understanding was, instead of having to cut stamps with scissors, they were perforations. So in theory, you would tear the stamps.
Absolutely, yeah, that's correct. If you can imagine a busy post office and someone's got to physically get a pair of scissors and cut every stamp out that somebody wants to buy, it was very time consuming. And as you quite rightly said, quite often it wasn't accurately done. So you'd miss half the stamp or bits off the bottom corners of the stamp. So there were various experimentations going on in the late 1840s, 1850, and eventually they came up with a perforation machine that produces the perforations we know today. To measure these perforations, there's various perforation guides, which are usually very cheap and are basically a piece of card or a piece of perspex with lines or dots on them, and you just line it up with the stamp. The Stanley Gibbons perforation guide costs £6.95. However, if you're extremely wealthy and want to splash out on an electronic guide, which you just stick the stamp underneath the screen and it gives you the exact measurement to the nearest hundredth of a centimetre, hundredth of a perforation, you can spend £275 on one.
Who knew such a thing existed? Marvellous.
Exactly. I hasten to add, I don't have one of those.
I was going to say, is this a gentle hint for your Christmas list, Pete?
No. I think if I had everything else I wanted and all the stamps I wanted, it might be worth investing. But to be honest, £6.95 against £275, there's no contest.
So
really.
buy the cheaper one and put the rest of the money towards a nice stamp.
Absolutely, yeah. Just as an example, this first stamp we're looking at, I thought I'd show you why it's worth looking at perforations. This is a very common stamp. It's a 1 pièce orange from King George VI era. And as I said, it's a common stamp. It has a catalogue value of round about £3. And that's exactly what that one is, it's £3. However, this one has the perforation of 12.5 all the way round. If you manage to find one that's got a perforation of 13.5 across the top and 12.5 at the sides, that value goes up to £550. So it's well worth, if you buy a perforation guide and find one stamp like that, you've more than made up for your time and effort.
So in theory, when the printers were actually printing the stamps, they were the people responsible for the perforations, or was that to create a stamp you have a blank sheet of paper with perforations and then they print the stamp at sort of intervals? Which comes first?
Normally, and certainly initially, the stamp was printed on a sheet of paper first, with all 240 stamps separated by a margin, and then they have a machine that inserts the perforations.
So the perforations would come after?
Yes.
So it's rather like a template they would put on it, and they need to make sure they put the right template with the right number of perforations for that stamp?
Yeah, the perforation machine actually only does one line of perforations at a time, and they move it across. Otherwise, there would be innumerous combinations that they would have to produce in machines. So it generally, and there are a few variations of this, but generally it does one line at a time, all the vertical sized, and then they turn the sheet round and it does one line at a time, all the horizontal ones. But of course mistakes happen, and sometimes they use a different machine, or sometimes it, for whatever reasons, by mistake or because they decided they want to change it, you get various combinations of perforation. And that was the case in this one. So as I said, it can make the difference between £3 or £550. It's well worth looking for. The perforation guides take two sort of forms. This one is what's called the Instanta guide, which is currently on sale at Stanley Gibbons, as I said, for £6.95. And it's a perspex sheet with lots and lots of lines on it, which get wider and wider apart. And all you do is slide the stamp up and down until it matches up, the perforations match up to the lines. And the dark colour background is just there because it's easier to see against the dark background than it is against the light background. There are other types of guides around, and also an old Stanley Gibbon type where it's just on a piece of paper or on a piece of card. But the principle is the same. You slide your stamp around until you find one that it matches up to. Obviously that's much easier than finding 2 centimetres of stamp and counting the number of perforations. And both of these guides are very, very easy to use. So we're just going to have a look at how to use them and how easy it is to make them work. The first one we're going to look at, I chose this set because it's a fairly common set, but it was printed in 2 different perforations. Firstly, it was printed here with a perforation of 14, and then for some reason or another they changed it to a perf of 17.5 by 18, which is a very, very tiny, close together perforation. And I should imagine the perf 17.5 18 probably came apart very, very easily. And now I'm not entirely sure why they changed from one to the other, but once again it makes a big difference between which ones you have. I'm lucky enough to have both sets used complete, but to give you an example, the perf 14 set, which is on the left, is catalogue value of £35 used and £180 mint, whereas the one on the right, the perf 17, is £60 used and £400 mint. So once again you can see why it's worth checking the perforations. And in actual fact, this set, the perf 17.5 by 18, are so close together it's very easy to spot, and you could probably do this without the perforation guide. I actually don't follow the instructions for using this guide. I do it differently because I've found it much easier. The instructions Stanley Gibbons give is that you put the stamp in between the perspex sheet and the dark background, and you slide the perspex sheet up and down. The problem I find with that is if you slide the perspex sheet up and down, the stamp moves up and down as well. So it's much easier, I find it much easier, just to slide the stamp up and down until it reaches the right spot. And as you can see, generally you know what you're looking for. I know this is either going to be 14 or it's going to be 17.5. So it's easy to check. And all I do is lay the stamp on the top, and when the lines on the guide match up with the points on the perforation, then I know that's the right one. So we've got the 17.5 at the top and the 14 at the bottom.
How clever is that? I've never actually seen that done. Very impressed with that.
Yeah, and it's very easy. And I've just done a close-up here so you can see it more clearly. But as you can see on here, the one on the left matches up with the 17.5. As I said, the points on all the perforations match up with the lines on the 17.5. And the one on the right matches up with the 14. As I said, it's quite easy. It's not a difficult skill, but it's one well worth investing in your time to see what you can find. And I've just put a few more examples on here to ensure that it all makes sense to you. This next one we're looking at are some Canada sets from King George V. And these are quite good because they show coil stamps and booklet stamps. Coil stamps are stamps that are produced in coils, as the name suggests, from a machine. So you could walk into the post office and instead of standing at the counter saying, I want 5 1-cent stamps, you could put the money in the machine and they would come out, rather like a ticket machine when you go to the cinema or something like that. And they always had different perforations. They needed to be a bit stronger going through the machine, so they tended to have smaller perforations. And in this particular set, you've got some that were in coils from machines, some, and I don't quite know why they did this, but you could buy them in coils over the counter. If you're going to buy them over the counter, you might as well buy ordinary ones. However, they did that. And you could also buy them in booklets, again, which were perforated slightly differently, just to make them stronger. So we look at this, the original set has a perforation of 12 all the way round, but coil stamps were imperf by perf 8 or perf 8 by imperf. And imperf means there are no perforations, it's just a straight line. Because obviously if it's in a coil, you didn't need a perforation at the side. Or they were in booklets where they were perf 12 by imperf. So in that particular set, there's 4 different varieties of perforations you can get. And once again, there's totally different values between all 3, ranging from £5.50 for the ordinary mint stamp up to £65 for the perf 8 by imperf. As I said, once again, it shows it's worth looking at. And there's another set from King George VI Canada. There's 3 different variations. The problem with the Instanta perforation guide that I bought from Stanley Gibbons is it's not big enough. It doesn't go down to 8. The smallest number it goes down to is 10. So I've had to use this. This is an old, it's called an ideal or a new ideal perforation guide. But this is rather like a lot of the other perforation guides. And this one goes down much lower, so I was able to check exactly which one was which. And it works in exactly the same way. This one, it's quite useful, it has dots, and the idea is you match up the holes with the dots on the stamp, which is quite an easy way to do it actually. The one drawback with this is you either have 12, 12.5, 13, 13.5. There's nothing in between, whereas the Instanta guide, you can slide it so you can ostensibly have 13.7 and 13.8, which is sometimes useful because if the stamp has been soaked off an envelope, sometimes they stretch or they shrink. So you'll get a slight variation and then it gets a bit of judgment as to whether it's the 12.5 or the 12. So the next one I want to look at is the Gibraltar set, King George VI Gibraltar set. I've talked about this set on a previous video podcast. It's a good set to collect because there are, on every value, or almost every value, there are 3 different size perforations as well as different shades. And this perfectly illustrates that. So there's 4 different stamps here, ranging in value from £4.50 to £130 in mint condition. Unfortunately, I don't have the mint ones, but the principle applies the same to the used stamps. Once again, it's a simple matter of lining up the stamp in the right place on the perforation guide and deciding which one it is. On this particular stamp, you're looking for perf 13, perf 13.5, or perf 14. As you can see, this one we're looking at is perf 13 and 13.5, which is valued at £45 mint. The next one we look at, again, with this stamp, you're only looking at perf 13, perf 13.5 or perf 14. So there's only 3 you need to check, and it's just lining it up. And you can see, as I said, this is actually slightly bigger than 14, but it's not far, it's 14.1 or 14.2, but it's definitely perf 14, which, had that been mint, would be worth £130. And then this one is the basic stamp, the perf 13, which unfortunately is only worth £4.50 mint. And unsurprisingly, I've got lots of those. And as I said, this particular set, every value has different perforations, and in this case different shades as well. So it's a set worth investing in a perforation guide just to look at. One final thing before we go, just to reiterate the difference in values. This is a Gold Coast set, and this was issued in 2 size perforations, and it was a mistake. They did it perforation 12 by 11.5, but on a few sheets they put it the other way around, so it became 11.5 by 12. So that means instead of the side being 11.5, the top and bottom are 11.5, and instead of the top and bottom being 12, the sides are 12. And that makes a difference. In this set, those 9 stamps mint are worth £8.50 in normal condition. But if you've got one with the perforations the other way round, it's valued at £170. So, as I said, it is worth investing your time and very little money to find out what the perforations are. Okay, so I hope that's helped. I hope from that you've been able to see the benefits of checking perforations, but also you can understand more how to do it and how simple it is.
I think for me it's actually been quite interesting to learn a little bit more about the world of stamp collecting, and from a stamp collector's point of view, which clearly I'm not, all the different things to look for that can make a difference to the value of the stamp. So yeah, interesting.
Well, that's what makes stamp collecting so much fun. It's not just one stamp. There's lots of little quirks and variations that you need to look out. So it's a bit like being Sherlock Holmes as well as being a stamp collector. So thank you for listening, and I hope to see you again in a couple of weeks' time on Ourdadsstamps podcast. Thank you for listening to the podcast. I hope you found it interesting and enjoyable. Don't forget you can visit my online stores at eBay and Delcamp under the name of Ourdadsstamps, where I have over 2,000 items for sale. Please join us again in 2 weeks' time for another edition of Ourdadsstamps podcast.